Part 1 of the Meno starts off with Meno asking Socrates if virtue can be taught. Socrates responds that he does not know whether or not it can be taught because he doesn't know what virtue is in the first place. He then asks Meno to define virtue. Meno's first definition of virtue is that it is relative to the person. He explains that the virtue of a woman is to manage a household and be submissive to her husband, while the virtue of a soldier is to be brave in war. Socrates rejects the definition of virtue because Meno simply gives examples of virtue. It doesn't define virtue as a whole. Socrates says that there must be something in common with all of the virtues. That's why they are called virtues. Socrates thinks that a good definition must identify what it is they have in common. Second definition. Meno's second definition of virtue is that it is the ability to rule men. Socrates responds that the ability to rule men is only virtuous if it is just. And once again, being just is one example of virtue. It doesn't define virtue. Socrates uses shapes as an analogy to explain how virtue should be defined. Shapes can't be defined as squares, circles, and triangles. They are only examples of shapes. What they have in common is what qualifies them to be a shape. Third definition. Meno's third definition of virtue, that is the desire of beautiful things and having the power to acquire them. Socrates also rejects the first part of the definition of virtue because he claims that everyone desires what is good. Even if the thing a person desires seems bad, he still does so because he believes that it is good. You can't knowingly desire things that are bad for you. If you desire something, it is because you believe they are good. Socrates also rejects the second part of the definition because things can be acquired in an unjust manner. Meno agrees that acquiring things are only virtuous if done justly, but Socrates argues that failing to acquire things, if it is just to do so, is as virtuous as acquiring things justly. So whatever is done with justice is virtuous. And again, the definition counters the same problem as the other definitions, which is defining with examples. Part 2. After Socrates rejects Meno's definition of virtue, Meno claims that he is now confused. Socrates tells him that he is also confused, but still wants to examine and seek for what virtue is. Meno then presents Socrates with a paradox. How can we look for something if we don't know what it is? If you find it, how do you know that it is the thing you're looking for? And if you already know something, there is no need to inquire any further. Socrates' solution to the problem was to argue that knowledge is innate. He claims that the soul is immortal and it has already learned everything. When reincarnated, it retains all the knowledge it has. He argues that when we make an inquiry, it doesn't produce new knowledge, but it allows us to remember what we already know. For Socrates, learning is just an act of recollection. He demonstrates this by asking Meno's slave questions on how to double the area of a 2x2 square. The boy answers that doubling the sides would double the area. Then, after realizing that he was wrong, he says that adding 50% of the original length of the side would double the area. Socrates continued to ask him questions that eventually lead to the boy's realization that he doesn't know. According to Socrates, the boy's realization of his ignorance puts him a step closer to remembering the right answer. Socrates claims that they have achieved something by making the boy aware of his ignorance because now he can try to find out what he doesn't know, whereas before, when he thought he already knew. Socrates continues to question the boy, and the boy eventually sees that the diagonal line that goes through the original square can be used as the base of the larger square. Throughout the whole demonstration, Socrates only asks questions. He doesn't actually teach the boy anything. According to Socrates, the boy did not learn anything new. He was only recollecting what he already knew.
In Part 3, Meno goes back to his original question if virtue can be taught. Socrates argues that since virtue is beneficial, it is good. And since everything that is good must come with knowledge, virtue is indeed a type of knowledge. For example, courage is only good when it comes with knowledge because without knowledge it leads to recklessness. If virtue is knowledge, then it can be taught. After establishing that virtue can be taught, Socrates wonders why there are no teachers of virtue. At this point, Theaetetus has joined the conversation and suggests that any Athenian can teach virtue. Socrates argues that although great Athenians like Themistocles, Aristides, and Pericles were able to teach their sons certain skills like horse riding and arts, they were not able to teach their sons to be as virtuous as them. Socrates is now faced with the problem. Virtue can be taught since it is a kind of knowledge, but there are no teachers. He resolves the problem by making a distinction between knowledge and true opinion. He claims that knowledge is just as beneficial as true opinions. For example, a person who had the correct opinion about the directions to the city of Larissa can guide someone just as well as the person who knew the directions. According to Socrates, just like with knowledge, true opinion can also lead to the correct action. Meno argues that knowledge is more valuable because the person who has knowledge will always succeed, whereas the person who only has true opinion might begin to doubt himself and take a different path. Socrates claims that virtue might not be knowledge after all. The great Athenian men could not teach others to be like themselves because it is not knowledge that makes them what they are. Socrates claims that people who are virtuous must receive it as a gift from the gods. In Theaetetus, Socrates comes across a geometer, Theodorus of Cyrene, and asks whether he's met any young men who had impressed him. Theodorus immediately nominates Theaetetus, who not only looks like Socrates, but might also be similar to him in intellect. To test this, Socrates challenges the young Theaetetus and asks him, "What is knowledge?" Theaetetus first responds by giving examples of knowledge, like geometry or things you can learn from a cobbler. But Socrates rejects this and claims that he was not asking what are the objects of knowledge, nor how many kinds of knowledge are there, but rather, what is knowledge itself? We want a definition that captures the nature or essence of knowledge, which, as we saw in Meno, is a recurring theme in Plato's works. Discouraged, Theaetetus refuses to answer, for he doubts that he is up to the task. Socrates then encourages the boy to continue and tells him about his own mother, who was a midwife. He uses the image of a midwife to show Theaetetus that he himself does not have the answers, but has the ability to help others birth their own ideas. This image is supposed to describe the process we know as the Socratic method. In this dialogue, Theaetetus comes up with 3 definitions of knowledge, but in this presentation we will focus on the first, which is that knowledge is equal to perception. Socrates helps Theaetetus make the definition more precise and brings up the ideas of Protagoras and Heraclitus. By coming up with a theory of perception through these philosophers, Socrates will be able to determine whether Theaetetus' opinion is correct. Protagoras claims that man is the measure of all things, as in everything is relative to an individual view. This applies to a theory of perception if we say that every sensation is relative to the person feeling that sensation. For example, when someone whose hands are warm holds a container of water, and someone who has cold hands hold the same container, the one with warm hands will feel that it is cold, and the one with cold hands will feel that the container is warm. According to Protagoras, man is the measure. Both persons who felt that the bottle is warm or cold are infallible, yet each would feel a different sensation. Heraclitus, on the other hand, claims that all things are in flux, so this doctrine would say that all things we perceive are in motion. This is where we get the famous quotation, "You could not step twice into the same river," because Heraclitus believed that all things change and are never the same. To explain the Heraclitean principle, Socrates introduces his theory on the process of sensation. For Plato, sensation is the conjunction of the sense organs perceiving and the object projecting itself into the senses, which in this case produces the color black. But remember what Heraclitus said, all things are in flux. This means that the object being perceived is moving, and so are the sense organs. So according to this, everything we know through vision are constantly changing also. If we combine this with Protagoras' ideas, every person becomes infallible when it comes to judging their own sensations. In short, sensation is constantly changing and entirely relative to the percipient, meaning knowledge is also constantly changing and entirely relative. So now, Socrates established that every person possesses his own version of knowledge, but there's another dilemma. Not only is knowledge relative between people, as in K1, K2, and K3, it is also varying within one person. Socrates uses wine to explain this. For someone who is sick, the wine will taste bitter, but to someone who is healthy, the wine will taste sweet. Because a single person experiences both, his sensation becomes relative to his health. If this is the case, even within one person, knowledge is relative. In short, this is Socrates' first objection against Theaetetus. If we use Protagoras Heraclitus to understand what perception is, we learn that knowledge becomes relative to each person, which, as we know about relativism, leads to everything is true and nothing is false. Because of this, we lose all permanence and stability to the point that even our words have no meaning. For example, the word apple could mean a fruit one moment, liquid in another, and so on. This is not only a problem for Theaetetus, but for Plato too, because it targets his famous theory of the forms. The forms are the essence of everything in the physical world. For example, there may be millions of chairs in the physical world, but the singular form chairness is the essence of all of them. According to Plato, the forms are the only things that can give us any real knowledge, and most importantly, they are perfect, because they are never changing. As in, we may have chairs made of wood, chairs with wheels, or chairs with no legs, but chairness will always be the same for all of them. From this, it seems safe to assume that Plato could accept Protagoras' man is measure when it comes to the topic of sensation, but would totally reject Heraclitus' all is in flux, especially when it comes to topics like ethics or epistemology.
Another objection against Theaetetus is the fact that we have memories. According to Theaetetus' definition, to see is to know. So, to not see is to not know. But we know that we can also have knowledge through memory, and it is unnecessary for the perceiver to actually visually see to access that knowledge. In the dialogue, Socrates asks, Can a man remember, say, his cat, and at the same time not know his cat because he doesn't have his eyes on it? Of course, this is ridiculous. And to further disprove Theaetetus, Socrates gives the image of someone who has one eye closed and the other eye open. According to K equals P, only the eye that is open will have knowledge, not the other. It's safe to assume that everyone would disagree that this is true. The next objection against knowledge's perception is that it is possible to misperceive, like in instances of madness, dreams, mishearing, misseeing, etc. To make it more clear, Socrates focuses on the instances of dreaming. People's lives are spent half sleeping and half awake. When we're awake, we perceive through our eyes the real world, and we believe that what we see is true. When we're asleep and dream, regardless of the fact that they're just dreams, what we see, under knowledge equals perception, we consider true, even though it really isn't.
The last objection we'll discuss is when Socrates points out that there are laws that appear to be self-evident, meaning they are true in themselves, but they do not match our perception. So in this objection, we see that perception contradicts knowledge. The three laws that Socrates gives are: 1. Nothing can become greater or smaller and at the same time stay equal to itself. 2. If you don't add or subtract to an object, that object remains the same. 3. If something is now that was not before, it must have gone through a process of becoming. Think of having 6 cups and 4 cups. 6 cups is more than 4 cups by 1.5, but compared to 12 cups, 6 is less by half. In this case, depending on what we compare it to, 6 is less or 6 is more. Now let's apply the 3 laws. In one case, the amount 6 is called more because we're comparing it to the amount 4. But in the second case, when we compare it to 12, 6 is called less. So, the amount 6 stays the same, but we call it more, and at the same time we call it less. This goes against the laws, because the 6 cups did not go through an addition, subtraction, or any process of becoming that could lead it to becoming more or less, or in this case, more and less. Another way to look at this is through height. Socrates asked Theaetetus how he could be taller than him this year, and without his height changing, become smaller than him next year. The answer is, Theaetetus is the one who grew. But according to the 3 laws, since Socrates' height did not change, then we cannot say he's now shorter, because he did not go through a process of becoming shorter. To summarize, the 3 self-evident laws are incompatible with perception, proving again that knowledge is not equal to perception. In conclusion, Theaetetus is about searching for what knowledge is, and in order to reject the definition that knowledge is perception, Socrates 1. Disproves Protagoras and Heraclitus by not accepting that knowledge is something relative. 2. Recognizing the effects of memory and misperception. And 3. By showing the disjunction between knowledge and perception. In the dialogue, there was also a digression given an imagery of midwifery to describe the Socratic method, which is also present in the Meno. In both dialogues, no conclusion is reached to answer the original questions asked, which is, can virtue be taught, or what is virtue, and what is knowledge? But we do learn that we cannot give examples in exchange for definitions, and in order to define something, we have to establish what the word being defined is not. This is our take on Plato's Meno and Theaetetus. We hope you enjoyed it, and thanks for watching.